A courtroom is meant to be a place of order, fairness, and justice. But what happens when the person wielding the gavel doesn't realize the weight of the connection they share with the defendant standing before them? Picture this: a white judge, firm in his rulings, hands down a penalty to a black woman for a seemingly minor offense. To him, it's just another day enforcing the law. But in a twist no one saw coming, this defendant isn't just anyone. She's the very person who once stood at the front of his law school classroom, shaping the principles he claims to uphold. What unfolds next is a confrontation not just of authority, but of memory, power, and the unspoken divides that linger in unexpected places. This is the story of an encounter that left a courtroom stunned and a judge humbled in a way he never expected. Stick around as we tell the full story of this extraordinary meeting between past and present. If you're captivated by stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Our story begins at the highly regarded Lawson University School of Law, a place where the weight of tradition meets the spark of progress. Nestled in the heart of the city, this institution has long been a cornerstone for shaping the brightest legal minds, producing judges, attorneys, and lawmakers who go on to leave their mark on history. Its ivy-clad buildings echo with debates on justice, fairness, and the rule of law, and among its most celebrated figures stands Professor Angela Thompson. Professor Thompson is not just an academic, she's a pioneer. As one of the first African-American women to earn tenure at Lawson University, she carved her path in a field that wasn't always welcoming. Over the years, she has gained a reputation for her sharp intellect, unwavering dedication to justice, and a teaching style that pushes students to challenge their assumptions. Her lectures go beyond case law and precedent. She teaches the human side of the law, emphasizing empathy, accountability, and the ability to see the bigger picture. Among her countless students was a young man named William Harris. Back then, he was ambitious, but unpolished, eager to rise in the legal world. Professor Thompson saw potential in him and pushed him harder than most, believing he could achieve greatness if he learned to temper his rigidity with compassion. Harris excelled under her mentorship, eventually graduating with honors and setting his sights on the bench. Years later, William Harris achieved his dream. As a newly appointed judge in the Superior Court of New Haven, he quickly earned a reputation for his strict, no-nonsense approach. Known for adhering to the letter of the law, he prided himself on being impartial, believing that fairness could only exist when emotion was left at the door. To Judge Harris, the courtroom was a place where facts ruled and personal histories were irrelevant. But as he rose in his career, the connection between him and his former professor faded into the background. For him, Professor Thompson became just another name in a long list of people who had shaped his journey. He had moved on, consumed by the demands of his role, unaware that his past would one day walk back into his life in the most unexpected way. Meanwhile, Professor Thompson continued her work, unaware of the intersection their paths would soon take. Despite her accomplishments, she often found herself navigating the subtle challenges that came with being both a woman and a minority in the legal field. Balancing a demanding career with personal commitments wasn't easy, but she carried herself with a quiet resilience that earned her respect from peers and students alike. Their worlds seemed so far apart, one in academia, shaping the minds of future legal professionals, and the other in the courtroom, interpreting and enforcing the law. But the law, much like life, has a way of bringing people together when they least expect it. It was on an ordinary day in Judge Harris's courtroom that their paths would converge once more. What began as a routine case, one of countless Harris handled each week, would soon become a moment that neither of them could have predicted. And it all started with a seemingly simple traffic violation. This is the stage on which our story unfolds, a story where past and present collide, where power dynamics are challenged, and where two individuals, once teacher and student, are forced to confront the roles they now play in each other's lives. As we move deeper into this tale, you'll see that justice isn't always about the law. It's also about the people who live under its weight. Despite her accolades in a career that many could only dream of, Professor Angela Thompson lived a life like anyone else, marked by long hours, personal obligations, and the occasional moment when the weight of it all became too much. Balancing the demands of academia with her responsibilities at home wasn't easy, and like many working professionals, she had her moments where things slipped through the cracks. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of back-to-back lectures, grading assignments, and attending a faculty meeting that seemed to drag on forever, Professor Thompson found herself rushing home. It was late, and the roads were quiet as she drove through the city. Her mind, however, was far from quiet. Thoughts of unfinished tasks swirled in her head, emails she hadn't replied to, papers she still needed to review, and the grocery list waiting for her attention. But just a few blocks from her home, the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror brought her back to reality. A routine traffic stop, she thought, nothing more. The officer approached her car, professional but firm, and after a brief exchange, she was informed that her vehicle registration had expired. It was a small oversight, the kind of thing that happens when life moves faster than you can keep up. But rules are rules, and she was issued a citation and summoned to appear in court. The summons weighed on her mind in the days leading up to her court date. She wasn't used to being on this side of the legal system. As someone who had spent her career teaching others about justice, fairness, and the intricacies of the law, she found it ironic to be in this position, but she told herself it would be a straightforward process, a minor inconvenience she could quickly resolve. On the morning of her hearing, Professor Thompson entered the courthouse. She was dressed professionally, as always, her demeanor calm and composed. She took her seat among the other defendants, glancing around the room as she waited for her name to be called. The courtroom was busy, with people coming and going, lawyers whispering to their clients, and clerks shuffling papers. To her, it was just another day in the legal system. What she didn't know was that the man presiding over her case, Judge William Harris, was someone she had once known very well. But in that moment, as she stood before him, there was no sign of recognition on either side. To Judge Harris, she was just another defendant in a long line of cases he would handle that day. He reviewed the citation, listened to her explanation, and, true to his reputation, focused strictly on the facts. Professor Thompson explained her situation calmly, detailing the circumstances that had led to the oversight. She wasn't trying to make excuses. She simply wanted to provide context. But Judge Harris, known for his firm approach, was unmoved. In his eyes, the law was clear, and exceptions only opened the door to inconsistency. He imposed a substantial fine, citing the importance of adhering to regulations and maintaining order. For Professor Thompson, the moment was humbling. She accepted the ruling with grace, thanking the court before leaving the stand. But as she walked out of the courtroom, she couldn't shake a strange feeling, an inexplicable sense of familiarity about the judge who had just ruled against her. It was a fleeting thought, dismissed almost as quickly as it had appeared. After all, she had more pressing matters to attend to. Meanwhile, Judge Harris moved on to the next case, unaware of the significant moment that had just passed. For him, it was business as usual. Another decision made, another name crossed off the docket. He had no reason to think twice about the woman who had stood before him, no memories stirred by her face or her voice. But the events of that day would soon come back to him in a way that would challenge everything he believed about justice, fairness, and the connections we carry with us, even when we don't realize it. It was weeks later, and Judge William Harris was back in the familiar routine of his life. Long days in court, stacks of case files to review in chambers, and the occasional dinner meeting with colleagues. On this particular day, an invitation sat on his desk. It was for a legal symposium hosted by his alma mater, Lawson University School of Law, a place that still held a special place in his heart. He rarely attended events like these due to his busy schedule, but this one was different. The program promised thought-provoking discussions, networking opportunities, and, most importantly, the chance to reconnect with the school that had shaped his career. Arriving at the campus brought back a wave of nostalgia for Judge Harris. The ivy-covered buildings, the familiar lecture halls, and the bustling energy of students reminded him of his younger days. He remembered the long nights spent poring over casebooks, the debates in the classroom, and the professors who had challenged and inspired him. Little did he know, one of those professors was about to step back into his life in a way he could never have expected. As the attendees settled into their seats for the keynote address, the moderator stepped up to introduce the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "please join me in welcoming one of Lawson University's most distinguished faculty members, a scholar whose work has left an indelible mark on the field of legal education, Professor Angela Thompson." Judge Harris straightened in his seat as polite applause filled the room. The name sounded familiar, but it wasn't until Professor Thompson walked onto the stage, the spotlight catching her calm and commanding presence, that it hit him. The woman standing before the audience, preparing to deliver her speech, was the same woman he had found in his courtroom just weeks earlier. His heart skipped a beat as the realization began to dawn. At first, he couldn't believe it. Could it really be her? As Professor Thompson began to speak, her words flowing with the confidence of someone who had spent years mastering her craft, memories began to surface. He remembered her lectures, her unwavering standards, and the way she challenged her students to think critically about the law. She had been one of his toughest professors, pushing him to see beyond the black and white text of legal statutes and into the gray areas where humanity and justice intersected. The memories came rushing back in vivid detail. He recalled the late-night study sessions, trying to decipher her feedback on his essays, and the moments of triumph when he finally understood the lessons she was teaching. She had shaped his thinking in ways he hadn't fully appreciated until that moment. And now, here she was, standing in front of a room full of legal professionals, speaking about the very principles he upheld in his courtroom every day. As Judge Harris sat there, his mind raced. How could he not have recognized her in court? Was it the years that had passed, the context of their encounter, or simply the fact that he had stopped seeing people as individuals and started seeing them as cases? Whatever the reason, the realization hit him like a tidal wave. The woman he had found was not just another defendant. She was someone who had played a pivotal role in his journey to the bench. After the keynote address, Judge Harris lingered, waiting for the crowd to thin out. He couldn't leave without speaking to her, but he wasn't sure what he would say. How do you approach someone you've unknowingly wronged, someone who once stood as your mentor and guide? As Professor Thompson wrapped up her conversations with attendees, Judge Harris finally approached her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Professor Thompson," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. She turned to face him, a polite but questioning look on her face. "I don't know if you remember me," he continued, "but I was one of your students many years ago, William Harris." Her eyes lit up with recognition. "Of course, Judge Harris," she said, a warm smile spreading across her face. "How could I forget? You were one of my most determined students." Their exchange was brief, cordial, and professional. But as they spoke, the weight of their recent courtroom encounter hung silently between them. Judge Harris didn't mention it that day, unsure of how to broach the subject. Instead, he walked away from the symposium with a mix of emotions: gratitude for the role she had played in his life, and a growing sense of regret for the way he had treated her in court. That night, as he sat alone in his chambers, Judge Harris reflected on the events of the past weeks. He thought about his approach to justice, the rigidity of his rulings, and the way he had overlooked the humanity of the people who stood before him. For the first time in a long time, he began to question whether his strict adherence to the letter of the law was truly serving the ideals he had sworn to uphold. This revelation would mark a turning point for Judge Harris, setting the stage for a journey of introspection, growth, and ultimately a deeper understanding of what it means to truly deliver justice. Judge William Harris could not escape the weight of what he had realized. Day after day, As he presided over new cases, his mind kept drifting back to that courtroom moment with Professor Angela Thompson. What troubled him most wasn't just the fact that he hadn't recognized her. It was the realization of how detached he had become from the people standing before him. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to remain impartial, to rule solely on facts and the law. But now he couldn't help but wonder, had he let his approach rob him of something essential, something human? In the privacy of his chambers, Judge Harris wrestled with his guilt. He replayed the events of that day, questioning the fairness of his decision. Had he truly treated her as he would have treated anyone else, or had his judgment been colored by unconscious biases? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about one case or one person. It was about a pattern, a way of thinking that had taken root in his judicial philosophy over the years. Seeking clarity, he turned to trusted colleagues and mentors, individuals he respected for their wisdom and experience. In conversations that were both challenging and illuminating, he opened up about his encounter with Professor Thompson. Some reassured him that his actions were consistent with the law, while others urged him to consider the broader implications of his rulings. "The law is not just about rules, Harris," one mentor told him. "It's about the people those rules are meant to serve. Never forget that." These words stayed with him, echoing in his mind as he tried to reconcile his role as a judge with his responsibility as a human being. But for all the advice he received, Judge Harris knew there was only one person who could truly help him make sense of what had happened: Professor Thompson herself. Reaching out to her was no small decision. He feared how she might react, whether she would see his actions as sincere or self-serving, whether she would even agree to speak with him at all. But he also knew that avoiding the conversation would mean carrying the weight of his guilt indefinitely. After much deliberation, he drafted a letter. It was formal yet personal, expressing his admiration for her work and his gratitude for the role she had played in his life. He acknowledged their courtroom encounter, admitting that it had taken him time to realize who she was. "I believe we have unfinished business," he wrote. "If you are willing, I would greatly appreciate the opportunity to meet with you and discuss what happened." He sent the letter with no expectations, uncertain whether she would respond. Days turned into weeks before a reply arrived. When it did, it was brief but gracious. Professor Thompson agreed to meet, suggesting a quiet cafe near campus where they could talk. For Judge Harris, the prospect of the meeting brought a mix of relief and anxiety. He prepared himself for the possibility of criticism, knowing that he deserved whatever she had to say. The day of the meeting arrived, and as he entered the cafe, he saw her sitting at a corner table, her posture as composed as he remembered from his days as her student. She greeted him warmly, her tone professional but curious. "I must admit," she said with a faint smile, "I was surprised to receive your letter. Judges don't often reach out to their defendants." Their conversation was candid and heartfelt, delving into issues that neither had fully addressed before. Judge Harris spoke openly about his guilt, his realization of how he had failed to connect the dots, and the broader questions this encounter had raised about his approach to justice. Professor Thompson listened carefully, her expressions revealing a mixture of understanding and thoughtfulness. When she finally spoke, her words were measured but impactful. "We all carry biases whether we realize it or not," she said. "The question is whether we're willing to confront them. The law is not just about rules, Judge Harris, it's about fairness. And fairness requires seeing people, not just cases." Her words struck a chord, reaffirming lessons he had once learned in her classroom but had perhaps forgotten in the years since. They discussed the pressures of their respective roles, the challenges of balancing objectivity with empathy, and the importance of accountability, not just to the law, but to the people it serves. What began as a conversation about a single case grew into a broader dialogue about the complexities of justice and the shared responsibility of those who uphold it. As their meeting came to a close, Judge Harris felt a sense of resolution, not because all was forgiven or forgotten, but because the conversation had opened a path forward. He left the cafe with a renewed commitment to his role, determined to approach his work with a deeper understanding of its human impact. And while he couldn't change the past, he knew he could honor the lessons he had learned by ensuring that his future decisions reflected the fairness and empathy that Professor Thompson had always championed. The meeting between Judge William Harris and Professor Angela Thompson could have ended there, two individuals acknowledging a moment of oversight, learning from it, and moving on with their respective lives. But both knew that this encounter held lessons far greater than their own personal reconciliation. It wasn't just about a single case or a single courtroom. It was about the broader implications of how justice is delivered and how the people tasked with upholding it must constantly strive for awareness, growth, and fairness. In the weeks that followed, an idea began to take shape. What if their experience could serve as a catalyst for change, not just for themselves, but for the entire legal community? They agreed to collaborate, pooling their unique perspectives. Judge Harris as the enforcer of the law, and Professor Thompson as its educator and critic. Their goal was clear: to use this experience as a teachable moment, shining a light on the biases, blind spots, and systemic issues that can affect even the most well-intentioned judicial processes. Their first step was to co-author a series of articles published in prominent legal journals, exploring the intersection of justice, empathy, and accountability. Judge Harris wrote candidly about his own journey, admitting how years of rigid adherence to procedure had sometimes caused him to lose sight of the people behind the cases. Professor Thompson, with her sharp intellect and eloquent prose, contextualized their story within a broader framework, drawing on historical and contemporary examples to illustrate the importance of recognizing implicit biases and ensuring equitable treatment for all. Their articles sparked widespread discussion within the legal community. Judges, attorneys, and law students alike found themselves reflecting on their own practices and assumptions. Some praised their honesty and vulnerability, while others questioned whether such introspection could coexist with the impartiality the law demands. But for Judge Harris and Professor Thompson, the dialogue itself was a victory. It was proof that their experience had struck a chord, challenging people to think more deeply about the principles they upheld. Building on this momentum, they began leading seminars and workshops, traveling to law schools, bar associations, and judicial conferences across the country. These events were unlike any other, part lecture, part conversation, and entirely transformative. In these sessions, they shared their story, dissecting it piece by piece to reveal the lessons hidden within. Judge Harris spoke openly about his missteps and the changes he had made since, while Professor Thompson provided the theoretical and historical context, drawing connections between their experience and larger patterns within the justice system. Attendees were encouraged to reflect on their own biases and practices, with many leaving the sessions feeling both challenged and inspired. Some judges admitted, often for the first time, that they too had struggled with balancing impartiality and empathy. Young law students, many of whom looked up to Judge Harris and Professor Thompson as role models, found themselves rethinking what it meant to pursue a career in law. And for those who had never considered the human side of the judicial process, these seminars were a revelation. But their work didn't stop at education. Judge Harris, inspired by their collaboration, began implementing reforms in his own courtroom. He introduced new protocols designed to ensure fair treatment for all, regardless of background or circumstance. These changes included mandatory pretrial assessments to identify potential biases in sentencing, enhanced training for courtroom staff, and a commitment to provide defendants with clear explanations of their rights and options. He also made it a point to engage more directly with the people who appeared before him, taking the time to understand their stories and circumstances, rather than reducing them to case numbers. These reforms soon caught the attention of other judges, many of whom adopted similar practices in their own courtrooms. What started as a single judge's attempt to do better gradually grew into a movement, with legal professionals across the country rethinking how justice could be administered more equitably. Professor Thompson, meanwhile, continued her work in academia, using their story as a case study in her lectures and encouraging her students to approach the law not just as a set of rules, but as a tool for compassion and fairness. Over time, their collaboration became a beacon of progressive change within the legal community. They were invited to speak at national conferences, featured in documentaries, and even consulted by policymakers seeking to address systemic issues within the justice system. Their story resonated far beyond the courtroom and the classroom, serving as a reminder that true justice requires not just knowledge of the law, but also a willingness to confront the biases and blind spots that can undermine its principles. Through it all, Judge Harris and Professor Thompson remained grounded, never losing sight of the personal moment that had brought them together. For Judge Harris, every reform, every article, and every seminar was a way of honoring the lessons he had learned from his former professor. For Professor Thompson, their collaboration was a testament to the power of education and the enduring impact of mentorship. Together, they showed that even the smallest moments of recognition and accountability can spark meaningful change, proving that justice at its best is not just a system, but a shared responsibility. As their story continued to inspire others, they reflected on how far they had come, not just as individuals, but as partners in a shared mission. What began as an awkward courtroom encounter had grown into something far greater, a movement for empathy, awareness, and the kind of justice that sees beyond the surface to the humanity within us all. This story reminds us that the pursuit of justice is not just a legal endeavor, it is a profoundly human one. In the courtroom, we often see the law as impartial, objective, and detached from personal experience. But this narrative reveals the deeper truth. Behind every decision, every ruling, and every case file, there is a story. A story of lives intertwined, of pasts colliding with presents, and of individuals grappling with the weight of their roles and responsibilities. The encounter between Judge William Harris and Professor Angela Thompson is a testament to the power of recognition and reflection. It underscores the profound impact of personal connections, even when they are hidden or forgotten, and how they can surface in the most unexpected ways. For Judge Harris, a moment of realization became a turning point, forcing him to confront his own biases and redefine what justice meant in his courtroom. For Professor Thompson, it was an opportunity to transform an uncomfortable experience into a catalyst for education and reform. But this story is not just about them. It is about all of us, the judges, lawyers, educators, and citizens who interact with the justice system in countless ways. It calls on us to remember that behind every case number lies a human story, deserving of understanding, compassion, and fairness. It challenges us to reflect on our own roles in upholding justice, whether in the courtroom, the classroom, or the community. As we reflect on this narrative, we must ask ourselves, how often do we truly see the people behind the titles, the faces, and the circumstances? How often do we pause to consider the weight of our decisions, not just on paper, but in the lives of those they affect? And how can we, as individuals and as a society, ensure that the principles of justice are not just enforced, but lived out in every interaction and decision? This story is an invitation to introspection. It reminds us that justice is not static. It is dynamic, evolving with the people who shape it and the lessons we learn along the way. And it shows that even in a system often criticized for its rigidity, there is room for growth, for connection, and for change. What about you? What are your thoughts on this narrative? Have you witnessed or experienced moments like this, where personal connections brought new meaning to professional actions? Do you believe our justice system has the capacity to balance the letter of the law with the spirit of fairness? If this story resonated with you, we invite you to join the conversation. Like this video, share it with others who value these discussions, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking stories. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspectives. Your engagement helps us bring more insights and stories to light, creating a space for reflection and dialogue on the issues that matter most. As we close this chapter, let us remember that justice at its core is about people. It is about seeing, understanding, and valuing one another in all our complexity, and it is about recognizing that even the smallest moments can spark the greatest change. Thank you for watching.